I'm supposed to really loud. Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Michael Greenman. I'm with Deltek, and I'm here to chat with you today in the first part of a two-part webinar series about why should you move to CostPoint GCCM. So along the way here, I'm going to give you a bit more information, but I'll start with a bit of an introduction about myself. As I mentioned, I'm with Deltek, and I've been with Deltek almost about 4 years now. And I'm on the product strategy team, specifically focused on product marketing. And I work with our sellers, I work with our partners, and I work with our customers and prospects at large to educate, but answer questions as well. One thing, could everybody go on mute, please, just so we don't have any background noise? Appreciate that. As I mentioned, I'm focused on product marketing, but specifically for cybersecurity, cloud, cyber compliance, messaging and information, specifically as it relates to our cloud offering that a lot of government contractors use, specifically defense contractors, and that's our CostPoint GCCM solution. Now, CostPoint is the software application, but we have two cloud delivery versions. One is our GovCon Cloud, and the other one is our GovCon Cloud Moderate, which is going to be the focus of these webinars the next few days here. So happy to interact. Should you have questions, I would say ideally hold your questions to the end if you can. But if you have something that's burning right away, go ahead and drop that into the chat, and I'll do my best to try to answer those real time, but at the very least, circle back to them at the end of the presentation. And so with that, so my part of the presentation this week, one of two, is to focus on kind of like the overview and intro of cybersecurity compliance in general, give you a bit of an update on CMMC. If you're not familiar, hopefully you are. CMMC stands for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, which is a DoD-specific cybersecurity compliance program, and we'll dig into where and when that came from. And why it's important. And then we'll kind of close out our session for today by talking about Deltek's role in CMMC compliance. We play one part of the whole piece, and as you'll find out through the course of today and certainly in the next webinar, what part Infotech plays in that whole system, which is getting your organization, your software ready for a CMMC audit if you have DoD contracts that require that. And then, kind of closing out today with questions and answers, and then certainly some tips, best practices for getting prepared for those audits. So I always like to start these kind of presentations with kind of a level set as to, why is data security important? You could swap that out for why is cybersecurity important? Why is compliance important? And that kind of comes down to the same thing. But kind of put it bluntly, cybersecurity is pretty important for a lot of reasons. Depending on your perspective, it could be cost prohibitive to face legal action for any kind of data breach. It could be patriotic to protect, U.S. intellectual property, specifically national security information, defense information from foreign adversaries. Or it could be simply the cost of doing business in the case of DoD contractors specifically when it comes to CMMC. So there's lots of different perspectives, regardless of the driver. We're all trying to accomplish the same goal, which is protect data from folks that shouldn't have it, and that you don't want to have it, essentially at the end of the day. There won't be a test on this later, but I want to just kind of level set with some of the terms that get thrown around. In my travels and discussions, whether I'm doing webinars or chatting with customers and partners in general, a lot of these terms and programs get kind of conflated or crossed over, but they all have kind of very specific lanes. So at a high level, on the left side of the screen there, you see the two different NIST frameworks, and those are specifically related to cybersecurity. When we're talking about cybersecurity, we're talking about computer systems, cloud systems, anything digital for sure. But many people don't know that even though NIST 800-171 might be pretty common terminology because that's what DoD specifically uses in the contract and their requirement, and the federal government at large kind of set that as its kind of baseline standard for protecting what's called controlled unclassified information, or CUI. But the larger body of controls where NIST 800-171 comes from is the NIST 853 standard, which was a byproduct of the Federal Information Security Management Act, or FISMA. And that was put in place specifically to protect federal government data, directly from the agencies that wanted to use cloud computing services for the same reasons that we use them in our business and, in our personal lives. So, but to do that, because federal data is much more protected or much more desired by especially foreign adversaries, there had to be, a kind of a baseline standard at that level, which is much higher because there's so much more at risk. So NIST 800-53 is the federal standard for federal cloud computing. And that comes into play, as I'll chat about a little bit later, but that is the foundational framework where the NIST 800-171 controls, which you may be more familiar with, come from. And so just kind of by the numbers, the 853 standards has, closer to 500 controls, individual controls to implement, whereas 800-171 has a subset of that, 110 controls with 300 assessment objectives. So, one is the parent of the other, and there is no such thing as NIST compliance. NIST is a framework. NIST it puts out these, control compliance frameworks as reference for government agencies to kind of like level set the standards. All right, we'll get into enforcement in a second, but it's important to understand that those are control frameworks. That's the reference. That's what you go back to. That's the encyclopedia of what are the definitions? Like, what am I supposed to do? But there's nobody from NIST that's going to come to your door and say, have you implemented all those controls? That's not what they do. CMMC in the center there is an enforcement program. And CMMC came about, as we'll chat about a little bit more in depth, as the DoD's response to making sure that defense contractors, again, not the federal agencies, the contractors like all of us, that handle that sensitive data, to make sure that those security controls, in this case, NIST 800-171, are implemented. As we'll talk about, there was a bit of an honor system approach that didn't work. So CMMC was the enforcement that came about to make it happen. Along with that, CMMC mentions and references the need for FedRAMP. Again, this is another one that gets kind of confused from time to time, but FedRAMP is, again, a federal cloud program. It doesn't necessarily apply directly to defense contractors, but defense contractors need to be aware of it because CMMC, for instance, requires your cloud service providers to have FedRAMP moderate level security, either at the authorized level or at the equivalent justification, which we'll chat about too. But FedRAMP, again, is a program. It's a certification program. There's also assessments, auditors that come from that as well. But again, a federal program that is a requirement that has its own marketplace for cloud service providers to put their services up for evaluation and for federal agencies to purchase from. But where it relates to today is that, again, CMMC does reference requiring FedRAMP for cloud service providers as a part of audits. And then lastly, ITAR, if you're not familiar with that term, that's the International Traffic in Arms Regulation, otherwise known as Export Control Data Protections. So ITAR is going to...
Quiet.
I'm sorry, was there a question? No? Okay. ITAR is specifically going to relate to defense. A lot of times ITAR requirements will show up in defense contracts. But for purposes of today, ITAR is just yet another federal requirement that does get enforced through contract clauses. But it relates to, again, the protection of data that is specifically forbidden from crossing U.S. borders, has to be hosted in the United States, and only serviced by U.S. personnel. So high level overview, there are definitely 2 hour-long presentations you can listen to that dig into that a lot deeper. But for our reference purposes, just wanted to introduce those terms. So what you came for, the latest CMMC updates. Again, hopefully there's a good amount of familiarity with the program itself. If not, happy to dig into that a little later. But assuming you're aware that CMMC is a program, a DoD specific program, and that it is going to become a reality this year. The following slides here, I want to just kind of reference, recheck, make sure that everybody's on the same page as to where things stand today, or as of January 3rd, when I last looked at the updates on this. So again, assuming that you're aware CMMC exists, it's a program that's been in the works for a number of years, but has now finally reached the finish line, at least in one part. And as we'll chat about in the next slide here, CMMC as an enforcement program from DoD, again, DoD specific, it's broken up into 2 separate rules. The first rule that just became for reality, published in the Federal Register last month, is what's called the CMMC program rule. And these numbers that you see on the screen here are derived from that particular rule. And just kind of give you an around the horn view here, the number in red kind of pops out first. So DoD estimates that roughly a little over 200,000, 221,000 organizations will need a CMMC assessment. Now, these are estimates. Could be higher, could be lower, just depends on what it is, but it's a rather large number. And the other numbers kind of around the hexagons there, you'll see 140,000 is what they DoD estimates organizations that will require a CMMC level 1 assessment. And just to back up a second, CMMC does have 3 levels of certification: level 1, level 2, level 3. Level 1s are all self-assessments, meaning that you sign an attestation, presumably after doing a self-assessment, to attest that your organization has implemented all 15 of the CMMC level 1 requirements. And you see that in the hexagon that's next to the 140K. But moving down a little bit, you see 76,000. That's the number that's probably more interesting to most folks. That's what's going to be new. So self-assessments and reporting has been around for a few years in different forms, but the CMMC level 2 assessment is what's going to be the most net new for defense contractors. And DoD estimates roughly 76,000 organizations will need that level 2 audit, independent audit at some point. As we'll talk about, there's going to be a phased rollout of the enforcement and the requirements, but in totality, that's what DoD estimates how many organizations are going to need an independent assessment. So what's that? What does that mean? So CMMC is unique in that, especially for a government program, in order to do business with DoD, once CMMC is fully rolled out and fully implemented, especially at the level 2 or higher certification, you're going to have to go get an independent third-party assessment. And that's what that C3PAO stands for, a certified third-party assessment organization. And a lot of organizations are certainly not used to that. And there's a lot of unknowns about that. And you'll be seeing a lot more of that as these audits start happening. But the other number I want to bring to your attention here, excuse me, is that as of January 3rd, and this is from the Cyber AB, this is kind of almost like a quasi-governmental organization. They're an independent, nonprofit, but they are exclusively, tied to the hip with DoD. And they are in charge of educating and certifying those third-party assessment organizations. And as of January 3rd, there were 35 that have been authorized. Now, the number was higher before the most recent program rule became final, but because of kind of a reset that happens, once that becomes final, everybody has to go get officially certified because the program rule is in place. And so that number of organizations is 35. The interesting disparity that you'll hear about is that you got 76,000 organizations potentially needing an audit, and roughly only about 35 companies right now that can actually provide those audits. Now, there's a lot more certified professionals But as the rule requires, it has to come from the organization, regardless of how many assessors there are. The authorized third-party assessment organization is a company, it's an entity. So right now, roughly, there's about 35 of those. So that number is expected to climb. But as these third-party audits roll out, there's going to be a bit of a logjam, and we're already seeing that. And that's a lot of the discussion out in the industry is, how is this load going to be handled? Because again, as we'll talk about, the requirement in some DoD contracts for the level 2 certification can happen as early as 2026, mid-year. And these audits sometimes take a little while. And that's what some of these other numbers are on the screen here. And we'll close this out. Up on the top, it's estimated that, an organization starting today to prepare for a CMMC level 2 certification would roughly take about 12 to 18 months to fully, be ready for that audit. And that's, implementations, that's education, documentation, all the things. So that's, again, an industry estimate. And then last number I want to point out on the screen is that DoD estimates that the cost of just a level 2 audit assessment is going to run you probably about $100,000. And the not so good news on top of that is that, once you pay it once for a level 2 certification, it's good for 3 years, and then you got to do it all over again. So that's a cost that's going to have to be budgeted into a lot of contractors' long-term obligations list there. So this is a good slide just to kind of kick off the conversation and give you an idea of what CMMC is and what it's going to impact the most. And so as I mentioned, there were two different parts or two rules that make up the CMMC 2.0 as it's known. The 32 CFR rule, the program rule, that's official. It was published on December 16th, so it's out there now. What does that mean? It doesn't mean it'll show up in contracts right away. This means that defense contractors optionally can go contract with a certified third-party assessment organization and get a CMMC level 2 certification if they want to. They're not required to, but they can. So that's the significance of that rule. The other significance, going back to the numbers slide before, is that because of that disparity between the number of certified, assessors that exist and the number of companies that are going to need a certification, there's definitely a backlog. Some of the more prominent third-party assessment organizations are reporting they're booked out through September of this year already. And again, that requirement isn't fully rolled out yet. And that requirement in contracts comes with the second part of the CMMC program, and that's the 48 CFR rule, also known as kind of the enforcement rule. And so what this rule does is actually puts pen to paper, teeth into the rule, so to speak. This enables the contract clause, and it's specifically the DFARS 252.204-7021 clause, to be put into contracts, where applicable, by the contract manager, who would then, also define what certification level is required, and any other details that would go along with it. That rule is not yet published final. It's expected probably Q2, but could push a little bit later. But a lot of the industry believes that this second CMMC rule is going to go final sometime mid this year. So think June or July. Could be earlier for sure. So certainly, keep your ear to the ground on that one. But that's essentially what you're reading about, what you're hearing about in terms of it's final, but it's not enforceable yet. It's because there's two parts of it. And that was done, on purpose so that the industry could prepare as much as possible to ramp up, so to speak, for preparing for these audits and being ready for when they actually are going to show up or the requirement showing up in contracts. So if you're kind of looking at the timeline, we already passed that first block there where the program rule became final last month. And that means those assessments, especially specifically level 2 certification assessments, are going to start anytime now. I believe there are audits assessments actually going on this week. So we'll probably start hearing about that, reading about that as organizations successfully make their way through the CMMC process. The whole program becomes official once that second rule makes its way through the process. And like I said, that's expected, mid-year, somewhere around this time, summer of this year. And once that rule is final, the CMMC program is considered official, final. It's ready to go. And what that does is trigger what's called the CMMC phased rollout. And that phased rollout means that DoD is not going to be like, all right, everybody's got to be certified tomorrow. There's just way too many contractors, way too much complexity. So they put together this phased rollout approach, this plan, broken into 4 phases, and this will occur over the next 4 years. And so phase 1 happens as soon as that second rule, the enforcement rule, becomes final. Again, still thinking summer time frame, but it could be sooner. And what happens when that rule becomes final? That means all of the self-assessments, all CMMC level 1 self-assessments, and there is a provision for one type of level 2 self-assessment, but it's expected those to be pretty rare. But either way, any self-assessments that are required as a part of a contract will mean that defense contractors will need to go through the process, and there's a detailed process, which I won't get into today, how those contractors are able to report their self-assessed CMMC, score and certification. And again, there's a whole process for it. And they've got to have that done in order to get their contract award, if their contract requires a level 1 or level 2 self-assessment certification. So that's the one that's right out of the gate. So exactly 1 year after that starts, so let's assume that it starts in June of this year. So phase 2 would then kick off in June of 2026. Again, hypothetical, not a fact, don't know this, but in my example here, June 2026 would then start to require CMMC level 2, independent third party certifications, right? With the whole third party auditor assessment, all the things. And it's not going to be retroactive. It's not starting June 26. Every contract that you have prior to that must have a certification. No, it's only new contracts moving forward. So all new contracts, once phase 2 kicks off, that require a level 2 certification will have that requirement in there. And as a condition of contract award, the contract manager will be looking for and will require that CMMC level 2 certification, which will come from one of those aforementioned third-party assessment organizations. So phase 2 is a big one. That's the real critical thing in this whole process. And so once that gets going, 1 year after that starts, so looking in theory at June 2027, that's when you'll start to see level 3 certifications start to pop in. Won't spend a whole lot of time on level 3 certifications because those are handled by DoD. And that's supposed to be, the top of the top type of data, controlled unclassified information that is so protected it's almost classified, but it's still considered, controlled unclassified information. And some organizations will need a level 3 certification. So those are going to start 1 year after phase 2, 2 years after phase 1 kicks off. And then finally, 1 year after that is full implementation, phase 4. And that kind of starts the whole wheel all over again. Every 3 years, there will be a new certification required with annual, affirmations, attestations that need to be done. One other critical piece that's worth mentioning here is that, it's bad enough, right? Well, not bad enough, but like it's a consideration. It's a considerable cost to have the recertification every 3 years, the third-party audit. But if you make any changes to what is your certified infrastructure to secure this controlled and classified information, you actually have to go get reassessed. So, once you get a certifications, it's expected that that's pretty well locked down. And again, if a change needs to be made, you switch out anything significant, and you need to talk to an auditor as to what that means, will require another recertification. So definitely questions to ask once you get to that point with your auditor, and certainly before you get certified to make sure that what you have is going to last in terms of uh, longevity when it comes to your certification, so that you don't, inadvertently incur additional costs for certifications. All right, so we'll be doing a bit of an origin story on CMMC now that I've got your attention about why it's important and how it's going to work as it rolls out. How did we get here? Like, why does this exist? Who signed up for this? So all kind of goes back to the enforcement of contract clauses. And, if you've been a government contractor, whether DoD or not, you should be familiar with what are called Federal Acquisition Regulations, or FAR rules, clauses. This is something that's been in the federal contracting space since the 70s, 1974. And, as you can imagine, put in place to make sure that there is accountability when it comes to not only cyber compliance, certainly not cyber compliance back in the 70s, but compliance with reporting, compliance with norms, expectations, and conditions of award when it comes to federal contracts. So the Federal Acquisition Regulation is the big behemoth in government contracting that sets all the rules. This is the enforcement. There are supplemental rule organizations, for instance, with defense, which is called DFARS, which is just adds defense in front of Federal Acquisition Regulation and adds supplement at the end of it. And that doesn't mean that DoD contractors or the DoD itself is exempt from Federal Acquisition Regulations. It just means that in addition to those, there are more specific requirements that come into play. And as it happens, CMMC is a defense-specific Federal Acquisition Regulation. So prior to CMMC ever being kind of around or coming to life, this was mainly the clause that was around to kind of baseline or level set when it comes to protecting data that is a part of these federal contracts, and that still exists today. It's the FAR 52.204-21 clause, which is the basic safeguarding of covered contractor information systems, i.e., digital protection of data. And this particular rule has a lesser subset of controls that need to be implemented, and just kind of let the basics of cyber hygiene, right? Make sure everything's password protected, and pretty simple stuff that most systems do today, but was never intended to be total lockdown security. In fact, it really only focused on what's called Federal Contract Information, or FCI. And that could be anything from literally a contract or something that is not classified, it's not confidential, but it's not necessarily public information. So it's somewhat controlled. All right, so that was kind of the baseline. And now pivoting over to DFARS, as I mentioned, is kind of a supplement of the Federal Acquisition Regulations. DFARS exists defense specific. If you have a DFARS clause, that means it's for defense contracts only. Doesn't apply to any of your other contracts, and certainly doesn't apply over to non-defense related contracts or requirements. And so knowing what kind of data is flowing through the defense industrial base, meaning all DoD contractors, defense or DoD decided that it needed additional security. And we're talking, this is back in 2016-ish, that this particular rule was getting kicked around. And you got to remember around that time, what was going on. There were some significant data breaches that happened to the federal government, specifically not so much defense, but the Office of Personnel Management. The entire database of government employees was hacked and leaked out, which I know a lot of people are still dealing with that this day and age. Along with another defense-specific program, the F-35, that happened to show up in different format with a different country's logo on it. Basically in a very sophisticated data exfiltration campaign that was sponsored by the government of China. So knowing that, defense tried to be proactive and go further than what the rest of the federal government is doing, And that was kind of the origin of this clause, which many of you may be familiar with and maybe in your contracts today. And that's the DFARS clause 252.204-7012. And that is safeguarding covered defense information and cyber incident reporting. Covered defense information, CDI, is just a fancy name for CUI. Obviously, nobody else in the federal government space uses covered defense information. It's DoD only, but it is controlled unclassified information from the DoD. So in case there's any confusion about that. And here's where you see the mention of NIST SP 800-171, as we talked about at the outset, which was a subset of NIST 800-53. So this was considered adequate security at the time, and still kind of is for the most part, but it's kind of a baseline. Required defense contractors to have a system security plan and a plan of action and milestones for any of the controls that were not implemented to be compliant. However, the big problem with 7012 was that there was no way to enforce it. It was all self-reported. It was all an honor system. You also see in DFARS 7012 that any cloud service providers must be FedRAMP moderate equivalent, which the only use of the word equivalent when it comes to FedRAMP moderate for cloud service providers comes from this clause. DoD is the only federal agency that has that language. The rest of government does not use that. So that's a DoD specific, term. There's also a requirement to report any cyber incidents within 72 hours and mandatory flow down to all subcontractors. So if you're a sub and saying, "Oh, I don't deal with that contract clause. It's not with me. I just work directly with the prime." Yeah, well, if the prime has got this in their contract, you automatically inherit DFAR 7012. So this is also very important to subcontractors in the DoD space. So I mentioned the self-reporting system, the honor system. Yeah, it just didn't work. So almost immediately, DoD realized through a number of studies, industry reports, as well as IG reports, that a lot of these contractors flat out lied. Certainly were not aware of what they were agreeing to in these contracts. And I myself have not signed a federal contract before, but as I'm told, there is a line there that says, you agreed to all these clauses, have you read them and all those things? And every defense contractor since 2017 has signed off in some way, shape, or form on DFARS 7012. So CMMC is kind of going to be a reckoning for some of these organizations if this data can be inferred as true. But you can start to get the picture as to why DoD moved in the direction of an enforcement program. So in comes CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification. The certification meaning that it requires external validation, verification of those controls that are referenced as a part of the rule, and that is the 800-171 framework. Now, CMMC, the reason why it's 2.0, why it's called 2.0 now, is that CMMC originally came about right around pandemic time, right around 2020. And the way it was originally rolled out was only one rule, and that was just the enforcement rule, no program rule. So through the course of things, it was kind of scrapped, mothballed, and pulled back, and then resurrected in 2022. And the 2.0 moniker is just kind of stuck. But the 2.0 model put CMMC into two separate federal rules. The one we talked about, the program rule, and then the enforcement rule in addition to it, and also kind of realigned the framework to hopefully simplify it, but probably not. And really just kind of made it more realistic to roll out. So this has been over the course of multiple years to get to this point. And again, you can kind of see why, the purpose of it and the iterations of it. But we've gotten to a point now where we're pretty much past the finish line because the program rule is final. It's on the books. And the only thing missing now is the enforcement rule. So if you remember nothing else from today's presentation, what is CMMC, right? So the DFARS 7012 rule that I mentioned and talked about where that came from and the why DoD wanted additional security to protect their data. It's kind of like the posted speed limit on the highway with no one around. It's 55. Don't speed. It's a rule. who knows if anybody's following it? In the example of this picture here, somebody just blew by going 63. Is there anybody there to enforce it? No. I mean, it's a nice sign to look at. So if you can imagine, DFARS 7012 is the posted speed limit, 55 miles an hour, in this case of the NIST 80171 controls. And CMMC is now putting cops on the street to enforce the speed limit, so to speak. Ultimately, that's what needed to happen. Otherwise, what was the point of having this rule there if everybody's just going to agree saying that they have implemented the security when all the numbers and the data say that that's just not happening. Now, some are doing it, a lot are not. And so speaking of enforcement, CMMC wasn't the first shot at trying to enforce 7012. There's a number of other DFARS clauses that kind of play into this whole picture, and they're complementary, and they were kind of done sequentially leading up to CMMC. And so if you have the 7012 clause, very likely you have the 7019 and 7020 as well. And what those clauses do are, set the foundation for the enforcement of protecting that controlled unclassified information. 7019 requires contractors to do that self-assessment, to report the score into a platform known as SPRS, Supplier Performance Risk System. I always get that acronym wrong. But once you're a DoD contractor, you're given access to that portal. And what it is supposed to do is it's your official way of communicating to the government what your cyber maturity score is, based on the NIST 80171 framework. 7020, DFAR 7020, that allows government, representatives to come on site to your facilities. You have to agree to that. And, this is very key when it comes to CMMC because those certified third-party auditors are working on behalf of DoD through that CMMC certification program. So that clause, allows for DoD or their subordinates to, come on site to your facilities and actually inspect what's going on with your security. Because some of the cybersecurity controls do relate back to physical security controls too. Some case access controls, cameras, people not putting passwords on stickies on their computers, things like that. And then, of course, the 7021 is the CMMC enforcement clause, which we've been talking about. And one other clause you just want to be familiar with, and I'll tell you why. So the 7024 clause is fairly new, and what it does is let's just say that you're doing all the things that you should be doing, and you're being honest for the most part with your scores, especially for those CMMC level 1 self-assessments and level 2 self-assessments. Let's say that you're putting in a score like, you are honestly out of 110, you're at, let's say 75 or 70. What the DFAR 7024 clause allows the contract manager to do is to verify the validity of that information of what you've reported and use it as a part of the evaluation process. So in the example of being honest, as long as you can back it up, I think you're okay. But if you're putting in a perfect score and there is evidence to suggest that you have not implemented all that security and you're not doing what you're supposed to do, the contracting officer through the DFAR 7024 clause has the ability, capability, legality to actually report you to the Department of Justice using the False Claims Act liability provision and the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative too. So, probably not for the folks on this call because you're here. For the folks that haven't been keeping up, haven't been doing a great job, they might have a lot to worry about because this really is intended to be not an instant crackdown because again, this has been going on for a number of years, almost a decade, and they're running out of places to hide when it comes to compliance with these federal data security requirements. So one more thing to keep you up at night. In addition to all the CMMC fun, the whole of federal government, as you might have caught when I mentioned before, right now the rest of federal government contractors outside of DoD, they really don't have that higher level of requirement. They only have the FAR 52-204-21 clause, which is a lesser subset of the NIST 800-171 controls. It's the basic safeguarding. It is expected that very soon, because there is a rule that's pretty much gone through its process, we're just waiting for it to be officially published, that is going to essentially be what the DFARS 7012 clause is, or CMMC is the enforcement agent, for all federal contractors. So let me restate that. If you are a government contractor that either doesn't have DoD contracts or doesn't plan to have DoD contracts, and you're saying, at least I don't have to deal with CMMC because that's a nightmare. You may not be able to say that for too much longer because this rule, which is again expected any time now to come out, to be very, 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 very similar to the DFARS 252.204-7012 clause, which does all the things that we've talked about with CMMC. So more to come on that. There's not as much detail on that yet, but like to point that out because it's not just DoD. DoD is first out of the gate with the DFARS 7012 clause and the CMMC enforcement. All federal agencies that deal with controlled unclassified information are very soon going to be following suit. So a little bit about data scoping. And I bring this up because of our partners, Infotech. They're going to get into the details of how we help, right? We're moving past the fear phase of the discussion into the how can we help phase. And it's good to level set on the discussion here just to let you know, what's in scope, where do I go, what's my name, how does this all work? So one phrase to remember when it comes to scoping, what's going to be enforceable, what's going to be a part of your eventual CMMC audit, is knowing where the data is and knowing where the data goes. I say the data. I'm specifically talking about that controlled, unclassified information, especially from DoD, and not just the stuff that you receive, but also the stuff that the CUI that you create as a part of a contract. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to tell you what CUI is and how it works and if you have it or not, but just assuming you have it or create it, where that data lives or where that data will live or be transmitted is in scope. So title of this slide couldn't put it more succinctly. It's follow the data. And so when it comes to computer systems, modern computer systems, we have a number of different hosting options, a number of different presentation options, things like that. And I kind of boil them down into 4 categories here, from on-premise, meaning that data and that computer that houses that data is within your 4 walls, so to speak. There's legal definitions to that, but you're not using a cloud service provider or a cloud service offering or a platform outside of your control to store that data. When you get into third-party cloud hosting or using a managed service like Infotech to host, to handle, to work with your data, there's different rules that apply when it comes to CMMC. And I'm going to avoid most of that today, but just to say, it's at the standard of CMMC level 1, level 2, maybe in some cases level 3. But as I'm going to get into, that FedRAMP standard is only going to apply to SaaS providers or cloud service providers. And I'll tell you why in just a bit. But just main takeaway from here is that where your data lives depends on what type of security standard that data needs to be protected by. Okay, so unless it's a cloud service provider, like we're talking CostPoint, GCCM, it's going to be at the CMMC level 2 or the NIST 800-171 standard, not to the FedRAMP standard. A couple of federal data terms, I'll kind of skip through these so we can get some more of the meat here. But FCI, CUI, CTI, ECI, CDI, you'll see these things thrown around. And I think we're going to provide these slides after, so you don't have to squint your eyes and try to read all that. But what to know about those different data types is, from left to right, public information, it is what it is. It's out there. Anybody can have access to it, not really protected. All the way over to the right, which is classified information, right? Locked, eyes only, I can tell you, but I got to kill you kind of standard. And then everything in between is the non-public information, not classified, but not public. And then there's different buckets for that too. I mentioned federal contract information that's, covered under the FAR 52, 204, 21 clause. It's, again, not classified, but it's not necessarily public. It's got some level of protection, but it's not the end of the world. We're really focused when we talk about CMMC, and eventually when we get into GCCM here, we're talking about non-public information. We're talking about controlled unclassified information, CUI, and then that breaks down into non-DoD CUI, which that's the coming soon, but DoD CUI, also known as covered defense information. Some of it can also be called or considered controlled technical information. And that's going to include everything, obviously, that's in scope, but need to be protected by the standards that are outlined in DFARS 252, 204, 7012. And that's, NIST 80171 for the control or for the contractor. And if you're using a cloud service provider like Deltek, in this case, if you have cost point and you are storing, processing, transmitting CUI data in and out of cost point, that's when we're going to need to talk about cost point GCCM. That would be in scope. If it's not going into cost point, then cost point would be out of scope for a CMMC audit. And I'll skip that one. Okay, getting to the home run conclusion here. What's our role? So a more streamlined version of the compliance responsibility by delivery. If you are storing, processing, handling your controlled unclassified information on premise, you're 100% responsible for protecting that data and to the standard that the government requires, which when it comes to CMMC, it's going to be that NIST 80171. And so you, as the contractor or subcontractor, that is your security standard that you need to follow. When it comes to a cloud environment, just generically, you'll get some protection inherited from whether it's Amazon or Azure or Oracle or Google, whatever. But you'll have to make sure that that cloud service meets the FedRAMP standard. They're not a service provider in that case; they're an infrastructure. But you need to be able to demonstrate the security that you are using. You're not just putting it in Bob's cloud environment, right? It's got to be in a certified secure organization or secure cloud. When you pivot over, for instance, talking about cost point in GCCM, our cloud, we are under the classification in that sense as a cloud service provider or SaaS provider. We call it software as a service. We are a direct provider. We're a service. We're people helping you, host that data. And so because our cost point GCCM offering has gone through the FedRAMP ringer, we are very much in the realm of assisting with CMMC level 2 certifications because we meet that standard for a cloud service provider when it comes to the rule. And what does the rule say? So specifically, I talked about that 32 CFR CMMC program rule, and these pages are from the most recent final published version. The requirements for cloud service providers that process, store, transmit CUI are set by the DFARS clause 7012 that we talked about, and that's that FedRAMP moderate authorized or equivalent. And the DoD CIO memo on FedRAMP moderate equivalency. What the heck's that? Pause that thought for a moment. So DoD finally came on, got on the record for what is equivalence, right? I mentioned before that that's a DoD specific term when it comes to enforcing their DFARS 7012 clause. So pause that thought. The other thing that was interesting in the CMMC rule is that there's a statement in there that says that an external service provider, ESP, that is a CSP, they love acronyms, this a cloud service provider, will be listed on the FedRAMP marketplace. So they've actually kind of made it really easy for contractors. They say, okay, if you're using a cloud service provider, let's go to the FedRAMP marketplace. Are they on the marketplace? Yes or no? If you read the CMMC rule the way I do, my personal opinion, it seems to me if they're not on the marketplace, you can't use them. So the good news is Deltek's cost point GCCM is on the FedRAMP marketplace. So what is that requirement? FedRAMP moderate for CMMC level 2. So from the rule itself, it says basically that an organization seeking certification, another acronym, OSC, may use a cloud environment to store, process, handle that CUI data in performance of a contract or subcontract. If the cloud service is FedRAMP authorized at the FedRAMP Moderate or higher level, or if they are equivalent. Now, quick aside about authorized versus equivalent, it's exactly the same level of security and exactly the same process. The problem or the situation is to get a FedRAMP authorization right now, you have to have an agency sponsor, meaning one of the federal agencies has to be a sponsor for you and say, yep, this cloud service is great, put them through the process. And that only happens when that cloud service provider is providing services to the federal agency. Now, what do you do when you're a company like Deltek in that we only sell to contractors? We do not sell to federal agencies. Well, we can't get an agency sponsor. So we're kind of in this no man's land, and that's where that equivalence comes in. So we have to do all the same things as a company seeking an authorization would do, except we don't get that title. We have to be classified as equivalent. And so what is equivalent? And that's where this memo comes into play. And I have deeper presentations on the ins and outs of this, but the high level is that in December of 2023, a little over a year ago, DoD put out this memo, and they said this is what it means to be FedRAMP Moderate equivalent. I'll save you the trouble. It's exactly the same thing that you would need if you were going to seek a FedRAMP Moderate authorization or an ATO, authority to operate, with the federal government. It's all the same requirements, all the same audit standards, all the same review by FedRAMP, except you don't get to be called authorized. You're still on the FedRAMP marketplace, but you do have to provide all this information to the FedRAMP PMO, and they're the ones that sign off on it. And once that happens, you're good to go. One more last thing on authorization. There are some companies out there that like to stretch the truth when it comes to their particular security. And let's face it, there's only a handful of actual cloud infrastructure out there, providers like Amazon, Google, like I said, Oracle, Microsoft. They don't have time to make individual apps that are industry specific like ours. So our cloud, our GCCM cloud, does leverage the Amazon GovCloud, which is FedRAMP high authorized and US only hosted and all those things. But Deltek and our CostPoint GCCM solution is not automatically FedRAMP high authorized because we, leverage that service. That's not how it works. And that's what this slide is saying. FedRAMP says you cannot inherit that. You actually have to go and add additional security and get your own audit in order to do that. So that's where the FedRAMP marketplace comes into play. If you are on the marketplace, that means you have had an independent audit. You, the company, you, the provider, you, the SaaS provider, like Deltek. With that, that's that additional level of scrutiny. So the basic summary of it is, if you're looking at a cloud service provider that claims they are FedRAMP authorized and they are not in the marketplace, they are lying. You have to be on the marketplace to demonstrate that you have gone through the process that's required of the audit. I'll skip through the last couple of these, but really, more or less what we do with CostPoint SaaS, whether it's in our regular GovCon Cloud delivery or our GovCon Cloud Moderate GCCM, is we offer a lot of value. It's an overall big picture solution. GCCM is more focused on cybersecurity compliance, but you still get all the great features and all the great value regardless of which cloud environment you end up going with. But the GCCM environment is just that much more because the security requirements to reach that standard that's required by the federal government is so high. And so as a part of how we support that, we'll provide you our customer responsibility matrix, our CRM, and then that body of evidence, which includes all those pieces that you see right there to support your audit. So that is good. That is your takeaway when you are a CostPoint GCCM customer. and you are going through a CMMC level 2 certification audit, we would get contacted by, your auditor, and we would provide that information. This is some of the details that still have to be worked out with the CMMC certification program, because it has to be done securely, because these 4 documents you see on the right, those are highly sensitive documents. You can't just, send those by email. And you certainly don't want to put those online anywhere. It's almost to the point of like clean room kind of data exchange. So some of those details are yet to be worked out, but that's essentially what you would get physically or digitally as a part of that delivery. So once
So,
again,
Michael, looks like we got a bunch of questions coming up in the chat.
yeah, go ahead.
We want to,
Yeah, these last couple slides here just kind of visually showing the difference between, if you're going to host with Amazon by yourself, it's kind of 50-50 responsibility. But, when you're with us, you're getting a heck of a lot more. We are your cloud, and you only have to do a bit more.
Michael, I would contend that you'd eat up any of that 50% savings by trying to have that hybrid model with a cloud provider like an Amazon. You still have a heavy lift on yourselves.
Yep.
So I feel like the Deltek SaaS is a better option.
so if we could just turn to the chat real quick, just because we're down to 3 minutes. So one person had a question. So FCI is also covered by CMMC and not just CUI.
Correct. Yep. Federal contract information is kind of the basic. If you are a government contractor and you have a contract with any federal agency, that is federal contract information. That contract is federal contract information, and really kind of everything associated with it. And so CMMC level 1 is a catch-all for that level of, as I talked about, not public but not classified information. And so that self-attestation, self-assessment for CMMC level 1, FCI would be in that realm. So if you do not have controlled unclassified information as a part of your contract or in general, you would really only be responsible for a CMMC level 1 certification. However, this is industry hearsay, and I'm just adding this extra color here for our friends on the call here today. Uh, it is anticipated that the biggest defense contractors, which, if they're not pushing this whole initiative, they're certainly on the bleeding edge of it. They've been preparing for CMMC since its inception. It would be a threat to their business not to. And so there is speculation within the industry that even subcontractors down the line that do not handle CUI will be required to go get a CMMC level 2 certification. Again, even if they're not handling CUI, just to be a part of that prime contractor's, offering. So take that for what it is. But that is speculation. So I don't want to tell you full stop, you only need this or that. Depending on the data that you handle, that's what you're responsible for. But always check with prime contractors and others in the industry to make sure that you have the level of certification that you will need to make sure that you can win contracts and get paid.
Okay, second question. To confirm, companies that conduct extensive M&A would need a new audit with every acquisition or divestiture.
It's a great question. I will not give legal advice, but I believe that to be the case.
Okay, and then another question. How would Microsoft's GCC High environment qualify?
Might need a bit more detail about that particular question. Is that questioner still on the call here? Do you want to unmute?
From ASFA?
No, I just provided an answer. I thought the question was GCCI is already FedRAMP moderate authorized, so that was the question. I wasn't sure if that was the question.
Yeah, when you leverage that, obviously the data going into it, yeah, you're covered. It would be any other entities that would have access to that and how that data is handled in transit. So there's just, other ancillary parts of that I wouldn't want to give you a catch-all answer without knowing the full scope of the question.
Okay, and then another question. So if a company is using a small machine shop, for example, they also need certification.
Job certification. Again, it might need a bit more detail, but is the question, I'm sorry, is the question on the line? Do you want to unmute?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah, so let's say we're get we have a prime contract, and under that contract, we need to go out and get something built. And we go to a small machine shop or a metal bender or something like that, mom and pop shop or whatever, or vendors we've been using in the past, built for the Navy, let's say. Do we have to make sure that now they're certified? Or, I mean,
It all depends. Are they going to transmit, handle, process, store any CUI data, or where do they fit into that? So I go back to the follow the data. So if they're not storing, processing, handling, doing anything with CUI, they're out of scope for CMMC. But if you do need to share protected data with them, or they will be creating that, yeah, you are going to be on the hook for making sure that that piece of the contract, that's not like a broken link, so to speak. And in that case, would you be you're the prime, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you as the prime, you would be ultimately responsible for making sure that subcontractor, if they are handling, storing, processing, thinking about CUI data, just to make sure that you're covered.
So they're going to limit the playing field for outsourcing projects.
Yeah, no, this will reshape a lot of how business is done today. And so that's, personally why I'm out doing these webinars all the time, is just bring awareness to this, because it's probably going to affect defense contractors in so many ways that can't be anticipated. But because you're ahead of the curve, you're here, right? You're tapping in, you're interested, you're learning. You can ask these questions now and come up with a solution before it's well past the time where you have options. Are there any other questions, Lisa?
No, that's it. I think that's it, Michael. We've covered all the questions in chat. Thank you.
Okay. If anybody's still around here for the last couple seconds, the one slide I didn't get to here is just talking about, that follow the data discussion I mentioned here. This is kind of a visual way to look at it, of, any data that's with the DoD contractor directly from, defense and doesn't go out to a cloud environment is going to be at that NIST 800-171 standard. But as soon as you go into the cloud service provider, it's, you get that higher requirement of FedRAMP. So just another way to kind of look at that. And so with that, obviously could go on and on and on, but hopefully that was informative for everyone. And if there's any other questions, feel free to email them, drop them in the chat, and be happy to get back to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. Thanks, everybody, for joining.
Thanks.
Thank you.